the Hanging Coffins of Sagada. In the remote mountains of the Cordillera region in the Philippines, mist curls around jagged limestone cliffs, clinging to the edges like spectral fingers. Here, perched precariously on wooden beams driven into sheer rock faces, hang the coffins of the dead. They are not hidden. They are deliberately displayed, a silent testimony to a ritual that stretches back centuries. Villagers speak in hushed tones about the tradition, an intertwining of reverence, fear, and a deep understanding of the spiritual world. The coffins are small, deliberately so, shaped to fit the bodies of the deceased, as if compressing life into an eternal stillness, a suspended state between the living and the beyond. The story begins with Luningning, a young woman from the village of Sagada, who had grown up under the constant gaze of these hanging coffins. From a young age, she had been warned never to approach the cliff edges at night, yet fascination outweighed caution. One evening, when the valley was blanketed in thick fog and the sun had disappeared behind the mountains, Luningning ventured closer than ever. Her lantern flickered, casting long, trembling shadows that danced across the carved surfaces of the coffins. The air smelled faintly of moss, damp earth, and the lingering residue of pine resin used to treat the wood. Each step she took echoed lightly against the cliffs, a sound swallowed almost immediately by the thick fog, leaving only a suffocating sense of presence, of eyes watching, or perhaps something else. In Sagada, the coffins serve multiple purposes. Beyond burial, they are a bridge. The Igorot tribes, the indigenous people of this region, believe that placing the dead in elevated positions brings them closer to ancestral spirits and the heavens. But there is more to it than mere proximity. It is also a protective measure. Predators, both animal and malevolent, are kept from desecrating the dead. Over centuries, the positioning evolved into an art of engineering and faith, a precarious balance between respect, fear, and ritualistic precision. Villagers whisper that improper burial or misplacement of coffins angers the spirits, causing illness, misfortune, or worse, a lingering presence that follows intruders into the mountains. On that misty evening, Luningning noticed a coffin that seemed older, weathered more than the others, its wood darkened, almost blackened, as if the decades had seeped into its very fibers. It was smaller than the rest, tightly bound with vines that had grown over time, integrating nature into the ritual. As she leaned closer, she felt a sudden chill, a subtle vibration that passed through her fingertips when they brushed against the wood. It was not the cold of the night. It was something older, something embedded within the coffin itself. She could hear faint whispers, carried on the wind, too soft to understand but urgent in tone. The shadows seemed to twist and coil around her lantern's glow, playing tricks on her mind, or perhaps revealing a truth too subtle to perceive at first glance. The village elders often spoke of the Watchers, spirits believed to guard the coffins. These were not merely passive observers. They were vigilant, sometimes angry, sometimes sorrowful. Luning's grandmother had told her stories of villagers who vanished when they disrespected the placement of coffins, or who saw shadowy figures lingering at the edge of cliffs, silent and observing, until the living could no longer endure the gaze. The mountain had memory of every ritual performed, every corpse elevated, every prayer murmured into the fog. Luningning could feel it now, the weight of centuries pressing subtly against her spine, guiding her attention to the darkened coffin. Suddenly the wind shifted. The mist thickened, rolling down the cliffs in gray waves. Luning's lantern flickered and threatened to extinguish. In the brief moments of semi-darkness, she thought she saw movement, a figure at the edge of the cliff, taller than a human, yet faintly transparent, watching her. Panic surged, but curiosity anchored her in place. She whispered a prayer her grandmother had taught her, words intended to honor the spirits and protect the living. The figure paused, then slowly receded into the fog, leaving behind only the echo of what seemed like soft, deliberate footsteps along the cliffside. This event was not unique in the annals of Sagada. Generations have recorded similar encounters, villagers and travelers alike reporting glimpses of shadowy forms near the hanging coffins, whispers in the wind that speak in languages half remembered, and sudden chills that descend without warning. Anthropologists visiting the region noted that the combination of geography, ritual, and local belief created an environment where the line between the physical and spiritual seemed permeable. Scientists might explain the whispers as wind funneling through cliff fissures or the mist refracting sounds, yet the villagers' stories hint at something more, a lingering presence that interacts selectively with those who approach the coffins. As Luningning stood there, frozen in equal parts fear and fascination, she realized that the coffin before her was slightly ajar, as if inviting attention. The ancient wood groaned, a soft creaking sound amplified by the silence of the night. For a moment she wondered if she was hallucinating, her imagination conjuring the spectral watchers her grandmother had warned her about. Then she heard a faint murmur, intelligible for just an instant. Respect. Respect. It was the word itself, carried on the fog, resonating through her chest. She stepped back, heart racing, understanding that some mysteries were not meant to be fully known, only witnessed and honored. The rituals surrounding the hanging coffins are as precise as they are terrifying. A body must be prepared carefully, often accompanied by offerings or prayers that vary according to the deceased's status, age, and the wishes of the family. Placement requires skill, as the cliffs are treacherous, and a misstep could be fatal. The wood must be bound securely, the beams drilled into rock strong enough to support decades, sometimes centuries of weight. Each coffin tells a story, not just of death, but of culture, belief, and the intricate balance between life and what comes after. As the night deepened, the fog enveloped the cliffs entirely. Luningning retreated slowly, keeping her gaze on the mysterious coffin and the faint outlines of the others that hung silently like sentinels. Behind her, the whispers faded, leaving only the rustle of leaves and the distant howl of nocturnal creatures. Yet the memory of the encounter stayed with her. The vibration in the coffin's wood, the spectral figure, the urgent yet mournful whispers. She understood now that the hanging coffins of Sagada were not just a cultural artifact. They were a living testament to the fear, respect, and mystery that humans have always held for death. As she descended back toward the village, the first hints of dawn broke across the mountains. Light scattered through the mist, revealing the full scale of the cliffside coffins. From a distance they appeared peaceful, even beautiful, yet their arrangement, precarious and deliberate, still suggested a quiet menace. Luningning knew she would return, drawn by curiosity and reverence alike, and perhaps by the subtle call of the spirits themselves. Even centuries later, travelers speak of the same chills Luningning felt, of whispered words in the fog, of glimpses of figures at the cliff's edge. The hanging coffins of Sagada remain a bridge between worlds, a suspended dialogue between the living and the dead. The mountains hold their secrets tightly, but for those willing to listen and observe, they offer a haunting glimpse into a culture that honors death with both awe and fear. And yet, as Luningning glanced back one last time before the village swallowed the fog and cliffs from view, she could not shake the feeling that something had followed her. A silent watcher waiting for the next soul brave enough, or curious enough, to approach the edge. The following days brought no relief to Luningning. The memory of that mist-shrouded cliff and the eerie coffin clung to her mind, as though the mountains themselves had imprinted their cold presence upon her consciousness. Villagers, aware of her night excursion, offered sympathetic glances and whispered advice. "Respect the dead," her grandmother murmured, her voice trembling slightly. "The spirits are patient, but they notice the living who wander too close." Yet, despite the warnings, Luningning felt a magnetic pull back toward the cliffs, a combination of fear, reverence, and an irresistible curiosity to understand what lay beyond the veil of mist and shadow. The hanging coffins of Sagada are not merely artifacts of death. They are the embodiment of centuries of belief and ritual. Each coffin represents a dialogue between the living and the dead, an ongoing negotiation that demands care and respect. Anthropologists who visited the region described a complex social structure intertwined with these burial practices. Status, lineage, and spiritual potency determined placement. High-born elders were often given coffins closer to the cliff's edge, reaching outward toward the sky, while younger or lower-ranked villagers were placed on more recessed ledges. Yet, despite these distinctions, each placement required precision, patience, and an intimate knowledge of the cliffside terrain. On this day, Luningning prepared to climb again, accompanied by her elder cousin, Thomas, who had experience navigating the treacherous paths and understood the intricate construction of the coffins. They ascended cautiously, the early morning fog curling around their feet, softening the contours of the limestone cliffs. The higher they went, the more Luningning could feel a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a weight that pressed against her chest, as if the cliff itself were aware of their presence. She glanced at the coffins they passed. Some were cracked and weathered, vines entwined through splintered wood. Others appeared freshly maintained, varnished with pine resin, their surfaces etched with prayers and blessings. Thomas spoke in low tones, narrating the history of the coffins, the rituals surrounding them, and the accounts of spirits said to guard the deceased. He recounted tales of villagers who had vanished or returned, changed after spending time near the cliffside, whispering of shadows that moved against the natural wind, of voices carried on the mist. Luningning listened intently, every word sending shivers along her spine. It was one thing to hear stories. It was another to feel the energy of the place firsthand. At the midpoint of their climb, they reached the same coffin that had terrified Luningning the night before. It appeared unchanged by the hours of daylight, yet in the morning light, the texture of its weathered wood was more pronounced, each crack and groove seeming to pulse faintly, as though it breathed in rhythm with the wind. Luningning stepped closer, her fingers brushing the surface with caution. The vibrations she had felt before were present once more, subtle yet undeniable. It was as if the coffin itself remembered her touch. Suddenly, a whisper carried by the wind reached her ears, more distinct than the night before. "Watch. Wait." She froze, heart hammering, eyes scanning the mist. Thomas, noticing her pause, looked around but said nothing, his expression tense but composed. The mist shifted again, revealing faint forms in the periphery, elongated shadows of figures, barely perceptible yet clearly humanoid, moving with a deliberateness that suggested intelligence. Luningning felt a simultaneous pull of dread and fascination. The mountain and its coffins were alive in some way, a silent sentience that observed, judged, and perhaps even tested those who approached. The rituals associated with the hanging coffins extend beyond placement. They encompass offerings, prayers, and careful timing. Villagers select auspicious days for the interment, often coinciding with lunar cycles, seasonal shifts, or ancestral observances. The process is painstaking. The body must be carefully prepared, wrapped, and placed within a coffin of precise dimensions. Then the coffin is hoisted and secured on the cliff using ropes, beams, and human strength, sometimes involving teams of villagers coordinating over precarious heights. Every step is accompanied by prayers or chants, calling upon protective spirits to guard both the dead and the living who undertake the task. As Luningning traced the carvings on the coffin, she noticed the faint outlines of symbols she had never seen before. Thomas explained that these were protective sigils, unique to specific families or clans, etched into the wood to safeguard the spirit in its journey beyond. Some sigils were meant to ward off malevolent forces, others to guide the deceased soul closer to the ancestral spirits or to heaven itself. Over time, the interplay of these symbols, the cliff's natural geometry, and the surrounding forest created a subtle network of spiritual energy, a lattice invisible to the eye but tangible to those attuned to the mountain's secrets. A sudden gust of wind rattled the coffins on their beams. The sound was a groan, low and resonant, echoing off the cliffs, reverberating through Luningning's chest. She could feel the pulse of centuries within the wood, the weight of countless rituals performed with care and precision. The mist thickened, coiling around their feet and legs, obscuring the paths, and she sensed something moving with deliberate intent among the coffins above. Thomas urged her forward, carefully guiding her past the precarious edges. Every step was measured, each handhold chosen with respect, awareness that a single misstep could send them tumbling down the cliff, or worse, incur the attention of spirits displeased by misbehavior. The legend of the hanging coffins includes accounts of the elemental, a spirit believed to dwell among the cliffs and coffins, observing the living. Descriptions vary. Some say it resembles a towering shadow, others a figure indistinguishable from the mist itself. It is said to intervene when rituals are performed incorrectly or when disrespect is shown. Luningning could not shake the feeling that she had glimpsed something akin to this elemental on her first visit. The hair on her arms stood on end, and though she tried to focus on the physical climb, her senses were acutely aware of every subtle change in the wind, every flicker of shadow along the cliff walls. When they reached the top ledge, the view was staggering. From this vantage, hundreds of coffins dotted the cliffs in careful arrangement, suspended over deep valleys and hidden caves. The mist swirled in the low sunlight, creating ephemeral silhouettes that seemed to move independently of the coffins themselves. Luningning's breath caught as she observed a particular formation, a group of smaller coffins arranged in a circle, almost as if conducting a silent ritual among themselves. She instinctively stepped back, unsure whether she was reacting to the human-made arrangement or to something beyond natural comprehension. Hours passed in quiet observation, punctuated by Thomas's explanations and soft warnings. The two of them sat at the edge of the cliff, feeling the presence of the ancient spirits that had watched over the coffins for centuries. The interplay of light, mist, and shadow created an environment in which the living and dead seemed almost tangible companions. Luningning could feel the layers of history beneath her fingertips, the work of generations, the weight of cultural knowledge, and the eerie presence that demanded both reverence and vigilance. As the afternoon waned, Luningning felt compelled to reach out again to the oldest coffin, the one that had first drawn her attention. Her hand hovered just above the wood, and she whispered a quiet acknowledgement, a gesture of respect. The subtle vibration returned, stronger this time, and for an instant, she felt a presence near her shoulder, warm yet unsettling. Turning slightly, she glimpsed a movement at the edge of the cliff, fleeting but deliberate, almost as if someone, or something, was observing her intently. The descent back to the village was no less tense. Luningning's senses remained heightened, each rustle of leaves or snap of a twig amplified in the mist. She noticed that the shadows along the cliff seemed to cling to her movements, a quiet acknowledgement of her attention, but with an air of judgment. By the time they reached the base, sunlight had begun to filter through the morning fog, softening the cliff's ominous appearance. Yet Luningning knew that the mist and the shadows of the coffins would return with nightfall, and that her journey into the mountain's secrets was only beginning. Even as she walked through the village, villagers whispered about the spirits of the hanging coffins, about those who saw them moving, about voices in the fog that warned of disrespect. Luningning understood now that her fascination was more than curiosity. It was an invitation from the mountain itself. Those who approached the coffins were tested not just for courage, but for the awareness, respect, and understanding of the boundary between life and death. Every story, every ritual, every careful placement of wood and rope was part of a delicate balance that had persisted for centuries, binding the living to the dead in ways visible and invisible. By evening, Luningning sat by her window, overlooking the misty valley, recalling the subtle vibration, the whispers, and the fleeting figure she had glimpsed. Sleep would not come easily tonight. The mountain had etched its presence into her consciousness, and yet she also knew that she would return. The hanging coffins of Sagada were not merely objects of fear, they were a challenge, an invitation to witness the delicate, haunting intersection of human reverence and the supernatural. The spirits of Sagada, the coffins, and the cliffs themselves remained patient, waiting for the next respectful visitor to approach, to observe, and perhaps to understand. And somewhere deep within the mist, Luningning felt the quiet, deliberate pulse of those who had come before, and those yet to come, watching and waiting from the heights above. Night returned to the Cordillera Mountains, bringing with it a dense mist that hugged the cliffs and cloaked the valley below. Luningning could feel it even from her small hut at the village's edge, a damp weight pressing against the walls and windows. Sleep eluded her, as though the mountain itself had claimed her consciousness, dragging her back toward the cliffside coffins where centuries of ritual and haunting lingered. She knew that the hanging coffins of Sagada were more than a story. They were a living presence, a silent test of those who dared approach. Tonight, the mountain whispered for her return. Guided by lantern light, Lu Ningning made her way up the narrow path toward the cliff. Each step was deliberate, every footfall measured against the uneven rocks, her senses sharpened by anticipation and fear. The fog rolled around her in thick sheets, swallowing shapes and sound, leaving only the echo of her careful breathing. She clutched a small protective charm, handed down by her grandmother, an amulet carved from bone and etched with symbols meant to appease the spirits guarding the coffins. Every tradition, every whispered precaution, felt suddenly urgent. When she reached the cliff, the coffins loomed through the fog, suspended like ghosts themselves. The ancient wood groaned softly in the wind, a subtle sound amplified by the silence that enveloped the mountain. Hundreds of coffins hung along the cliffs, some freshly maintained, others centuries old, their surfaces darkened by weather and the passage of time. Shadows flickered in the mist, creating the impression of movement where none should exist. Lu Ningning felt the old vibration in the air, the same pulse she had felt on previous visits, throbbing in rhythm with her heartbeat. Her attention returned to the oldest coffin, the one that had drawn her first night's curiosity. It sat lower than some, higher than others, its worn surface etched with symbols she now recognized as protective and ancestral. She stepped closer, leaning over the edge carefully, and whispered a prayer. The wood seemed to respond, resonating faintly under her fingertips. Then she noticed movement at the cliff's periphery, a figure, tall and spectral, drifting among the coffins. The fog bent and curled around it, yet it retained a defined, almost human silhouette. The mountain, she realized, was alive in ways beyond comprehension. The figure moved with intent, passing from one ledge to another without making a sound. Lu Ningning tried to steady her shaking hands, clutching the charm tightly. Her grandmother had called it the elemental, the guardian spirit of the cliffs, neither wholly malevolent nor benign, but exacting in its attention. Legends described it as the final arbiter of respect. Those who approached the coffins with reverence were observed, perhaps even guided. Those who came with curiosity alone risked punishment or lingering misfortune. A sudden gust of wind rattled the coffins and swept the fog in rolling waves. Lu Ningning instinctively took a step back, heart hammering. Through the swirling mist, she could see more figures emerging, shadowy forms blending with the fog, some hovering near coffins, others retreating just beyond her vision. A low murmur seemed to rise from the mist itself, carrying the echoes of countless prayers, warnings, and perhaps the voices of the long-departed. Lu Ningning felt the weight of centuries pressing down, a palpable sense of history intertwined with the supernatural. She moved along the cliff edge, cautious but compelled, toward a cluster of coffins arranged in a circular formation. The placement was deliberate, each coffin supporting the spiritual energy of its neighbors. In the center, a small altar of stones and offerings glimmered faintly under her lantern's light. She knelt to examine it, recognizing objects placed to honor the deceased, small carvings, flowers, and remnants of food offerings meant to sustain the spirit on its journey. The care and precision of the ritual struck her. These were not careless burials, but centuries of culture and devotion suspended in the mist. As Lu Ningning reached out to touch the central altar, the elemental appeared again, closer this time. Its form shimmered like liquid shadow, faintly humanoid but impossible to fully discern. Its presence pressed upon her mind, a mixture of awe and terror. She whispered aloud, offering respect and acknowledgement, repeating the words her grandmother had taught her. The spirit paused, as though considering her intent, then slowly receded, drifting back into the fog, leaving only the rustle of mist and the faint vibration of the oldest coffin. Time seemed suspended. Lu Ningning realized that the mountain's guardians were neither cruel nor forgiving. They were observant, patient, and exacting. The coffins themselves, the rituals, and the fog-bound cliffs were extensions of their will, a delicate balance maintained across generations. Each visitor was tested for humility, reverence, and understanding. Those who passed the test might glimpse the mysteries of the cliffs. Those who failed risked their spirit lingering with the mist, restless and unacknowledged. Hours passed unnoticed, the sun dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the cliffs. Lu Ningning remained vigilant, examining the coffins, absorbing the details of the ritual and the arrangement of the spirits. She began to understand the purpose of the elements she had previously dismissed. The spacing of coffins, the protective symbols, the placement of offerings, and the whispered prayers. All were threads in a complex tapestry that connected the living to the dead, the present to the past, and humans to the unseen forces that resided in the mountain. As the night deepened, the mist thickened further, weaving between coffins, caressing their wooden surfaces. Luningning sensed eyes upon her once more, not human, but aware, attentive, and demanding acknowledgement. A low murmur rose, as though the wind carried the collective voice of generations, urging respect and reverence. She whispered again, bowing slightly, acknowledging both the living and the dead. The elemental and the spirits seemed satisfied, fading into the fog, leaving only the gentle sound of rain tapping the stone and wood. Descending slowly, Luningning reflected on what she had experienced. The Hanging Coffins of Sagada were not simply a haunting spectacle. They were a living tradition, a dialogue across time, bridging the material and spiritual worlds. Every aspect of the ritual, every careful placement of a body, and every protective sigil had significance. They embodied the villagers' understanding of life, death, and the continuum of existence that stretched beyond human perception. The cliffs, the coffins, and the spirits were intertwined in a delicate equilibrium, maintained through centuries of observation, respect, and ritualistic care. As she reached the village, the mist began to lift, revealing glimpses of the valley below. The mountain remained silent yet watchful, as if recording her actions and preparing for the next observer. Luningning knew she had witnessed only a fragment of its mysteries. The Hanging Coffins of Sagada were patient and eternal, awaiting those willing to approach with humility and understanding. And she understood now, fully, that her journey was far from over. The mountains held more secrets than she could imagine, and the spirits would continue their silent vigil until they were again acknowledged by the living. Even as Luningning lay in bed that night, the image of the coffins and the elemental lingered in her mind. She could feel the subtle presence of the spirits in her room, in the air itself, reminding her that the boundary between the living and the dead was permeable, fragile, and ever-present. Respect and curiosity were not merely virtues, they were necessities. And somewhere in the mist, the watchers waited for the next visitor brave enough to approach, to observe, and perhaps to understand the mountain's haunting truths. Story 2, Poveglia Island, Italy's haunted plague grounds. The Venetian lagoon shimmered under a pale afternoon sun, its waters reflecting the fragile beauty of centuries-old buildings, gondolas drifting lazily, and the whispers of history that clung to every stone. But hidden among these idyllic islands lay one that few dared speak of, and even fewer dared visit: Poveglia. To the casual observer, it appeared as just another dot amid the expanse of water, yet for those who knew, it was a place where sorrow, fear, and death had concentrated over centuries, leaving an imprint on the very air. Poveglia's dark history began in the 18th century, though some records trace its association with death back even further. During the outbreaks of the plague, authorities in Venice, desperate to contain the disease, transformed the island into a quarantine station. Ships arrived carrying the sick and dying, and once ashore, they were never seen again. The island's soil soaked with the bodies of countless victims, and some believed that their spirits remained, wandering amid the abandoned ruins, restless and angry. Giovanni, a young Venetian physician, had been assigned to Poveglia in 1720 to assist with the plague containment. The journey across the lagoon was unnerving. As the small boat approached the island, he noticed the water near the shore strangely still, almost as if it were recoiling from the land itself. The ferryboat's hull scraped against jagged rocks, and Giovanni stepped onto the soil that had absorbed so much grief. He tried to mask his unease, reminding himself that fear had no place in the service of medicine. Yet, even as he moved, a faint chill crept up his spine, and whispers seemed to float across the misty air. The first days were routine but surreal. Giovanni tended to the living, administering herbal remedies and monitoring the feeble, yet even these small tasks carried a shadow of despair. Each night, the air seemed heavier, the fog thicker, and strange shapes moved among the ruins. Sometimes he could swear he heard faint footsteps in the abandoned quarters, or a coughing that echoed too clearly through empty halls. Other times, he glimpsed figures in the distance, cloaked in darkness, appearing to watch him silently before vanishing. The island's layout itself was designed to intimidate and control. Quarantine tents were arranged methodically, but the ruins of older structures, crumbling churches, and abandoned homes loomed ominously, creating a maze of shadows and narrow pathways. The isolation was oppressive. The fog rolling off the lagoon created an illusion of endless space, yet one could not escape the island once ashore. Giovanni began to hear the tales from older staff members, stories of patients disappearing overnight, of screams that no one witnessed directly, yet which were undeniable. One evening, while checking the perimeter, Giovanni noticed a small chapel, partially collapsed, yet its interior visible through broken windows. Flickering candlelight illuminated the skeleton of an altar, stained with time and perhaps something else. As he approached, a sudden movement caught his eye, a shadow slipping across the floor. He called out, expecting a servant or fellow physician, but only silence answered. The candles flickered violently, and a cold gust swept through the chapel, extinguishing the small flame he carried. Giovanni felt a presence pressing close, a suffocating weight that seemed to whisper in a tongue just beyond understanding. That night, he struggled to sleep in the barracks. The moans of the sick had faded, but they were replaced by another sound. Low, guttural chanting, or perhaps the echo of many voices layered over each other. The walls seemed to hum, and the floorboards creaked under invisible weight. He told himself it was stress, fatigue, the natural toll of the plague and the isolation, yet the unease persisted. Giovanni could not shake the impression that the island itself had become aware of his presence, scrutinizing him in the same way it had watched those who had died before. By the third week, reports of unusual incidents grew. Supplies went missing, tools rearranged, and shadows in the corner of one's vision seemed to move with intent. Some of the staff refused to leave their quarters after dusk, whispering prayers, crossing themselves repeatedly, and avoiding any part of the island not bathed in moonlight. Giovanni, compelled by both duty and curiosity, began to document these occurrences, convinced that the human mind was perhaps conjuring patterns from trauma and fear. But deep in his heart, he felt a certainty that rationality could not explain. One evening, a patient, delirious with fever, spoke of the black-robed ones, who came to claim those too weak to resist. The words chilled Giovanni more than any death he had witnessed. He asked the patient to elaborate, but the man's eyes glazed over with terror, and he muttered only, "They watch. They do not forgive. The water hides their eyes." Whether fever-induced hallucination or an echo of some older memory, the effect on Giovanni was profound. He began to notice subtle movements in the fog beyond the barricades, shadows that seemed too intentional to be mere tricks of light. As days turned to weeks, the atmosphere on Poveglia shifted. The island's historical record had long documented death and plague, but the present seemed almost supernatural. Reports of apparitions, of voices, of moving shapes, all became common conversation among the staff. The island was no longer a place of simple quarantine. It was a haunted threshold, a liminal space where the living and the dead coexisted uneasily. Giovanni felt the weight of centuries pressing against him, the accumulated suffering of those consigned to this isolated piece of land. The experience culminated one fog-dense evening when Giovanni ventured to the northern cliffs to collect herbs. The moon had just begun to rise, casting silver light through the rolling mist. As he picked the plants, a figure emerged, pale, shadowed, yet unmistakably human. Giovanni froze. The figure's eyes were hollow, yet seemed to bore into him, reading not his body, but his soul. A chorus of whispers, indistinct but urgent, rose from the fog. Giovanni felt a wave of vertigo as the figure approached, slowly, deliberately, until it vanished into the mist, leaving only the imprint of despair. By dawn, Giovanni had resolved something fundamental. Poveglia was more than an island. It was a living repository of human suffering, a nexus where fear, death and memory fused. And in the silence of the morning, as gulls cried and the lagoon glimmered, he could sense that the island's watchers, the spirits, the echoes, the remnants of those lost to plague, had taken note of him. His presence had been acknowledged. The question now was whether he would leave unscathed or join the multitude of souls bound to Poveglia, wandering its ruins for eternity. The island, silent yet insistent, held its secrets tightly. Giovanni's story, like those of countless others, would remain mostly untold, obscured by the fog and by time. Yet for those brave enough to cross the lagoon and step onto its soil, the island would reveal its truths in small, terrifying fragments, visions of the past, whispers of the dead, and a sense of being eternally observed. Poveglia was not merely haunted, it was a monument to mortality itself, and a reminder that some places, however small or hidden, carry with them the accumulated horror of centuries. The morning air over Poveglia was deceptively calm, carrying with it the faint smell of salt from the lagoon, mingled with the metallic tang of decay that lingered in the soil. Giovanni, despite having survived several unsettling nights, felt no relief. The island's oppressive weight seemed to settle more heavily with each passing hour. Every step he took across the cracked stone paths, past crumbling walls, and toward the remnants of abandoned quarantine barracks, reminded him that he was walking amidst centuries of suffering. The history of the island was etched into every surface, visible not only in the physical decay, but in the very atmosphere that clung to his skin. As he moved through the central courtyard, Giovanni noticed a faint residue on the stone floor, almost like dried blood, but strangely textured, as though mixed with sand or ash. He bent to inspect it, tracing its path with a gloved hand. The marks led toward the chapel, that ancient structure partially collapsed, but still standing as if resisting time itself. Here, the island's weight pressed upon him with an almost tangible force, and he had the unsettling sensation that the walls themselves were watching. The chapel had been the last place many of the sick and dying had seen, and Giovanni felt that their memories had somehow fused with the stones, lingering in the air like faint whispers. Inside the chapel, dust motes swirled in the dim sunlight that managed to pierce the cracks in the roof. The altar remained intact, though blackened by time and perhaps fire. Candles, now mere stubs, sat atop it as though awaiting the touch of a hand willing to ignite them. Giovanni approached, noting the remnants of offerings placed by those who once feared, revered, or simply wanted to appease the unseen. Among the stones and the remnants of ritual, he discovered an old book, the leather cover cracked and worn, the pages brittle but legible. The script was faded, but Giovanni could make out notes, prayers, and meticulous records of those who had been sent to the island during the last plague outbreak. As he read, he became aware of a subtle shift in the air. A low murmur began to rise, almost imperceptible at first, like the hum of wind across the water. Then it coalesced into words, soft, fragmented, spoken in a dialect that Giovanni recognized as a mixture of Venetian and the language of the rural villagers who had first fled to the island centuries before. The voices seemed to echo the movements of the fog outside, drifting through the broken windows and around the altar. He felt a cold pressure against his back, a presence that was close yet intangible. A shadow flickered across the chapel, pale and indistinct, yet it had form. A figure draped in the tattered remnants of a robe, its face hidden in a hood. Giovanni froze, his pulse quickening, as he watched the figure glide silently across the stone floor. It paused by the altar, hovering over the old book, as if inspecting the records. The figure's movement was fluid, almost unreal, and Giovanni realized that he was not witnessing a living being but something else. The residual presence of someone who had once walked these halls, now bound to the island by tragedy, illness, and death. He stepped back slowly, aware of each creaking stone underfoot. The shadow drifted closer, and with it came the distinct scent of antiseptic mixed with decay, the unmistakable combination of plague and death. Giovanni's mind raced, balancing fear with the need to understand. Was this a hallucination, brought on by isolation and the oppressive atmosphere? Or was it the manifestation of the countless souls who had perished here? The figure's presence was undeniable, yet it did not attack. It observed, almost curiously, as if evaluating him, measuring whether he belonged, or whether he would disturb the delicate equilibrium of the haunted grounds. For hours Giovanni remained in the chapel, documenting everything he observed. The shadows moved with a rhythm, often mimicking his own movements, disappearing when he turned quickly, appearing when he let his attention wander. Sometimes he thought he caught glimpses of multiple figures, layered upon each other, a procession of the dead replaying their final moments, forever trapped in the foggy corridors of memory. The book, the remnants of offerings and the shadows all spoke to him of a world beyond his understanding, a liminal space where the living and the dead intersected. As night fell, the fog thickened, rolling across the island in dense blankets. The cries of gulls and the lapping of water against the shores faded under the oppressive weight of silence. Giovanni lit a lantern, its small flame flickering in the thickening mist, revealing glimpses of the ruined barracks and the skeletal remains of previous structures. He could hear faint footsteps echoing on the stone pathways outside, though no one could be seen. Whispers rose from the fog, speaking in tongues he did not understand, yet he felt their meaning: caution, observation, and warning. The island's presence was alive, aware, and insistent. The longer he remained, the more he felt the island's history pressing upon him. The walls themselves seemed to pulse with memory, each stone resonating with the energy of those who had died there. He imagined the terrified faces of the quarantined patients, their silent prayers, their screams swallowed by the fog, their bodies committed to the soil or the water without ceremony. And yet, their echoes remained, not malevolent, but insistent. A reminder that death is never final when the land itself remembers. Hours passed like days. Giovanni wandered through the island's ruins, moving from chapel to barracks to the northern cliffs, each step revealing the same pattern: remnants of human suffering intertwined with the mist, guiding him, testing him, and sometimes deceiving him. Shadows darted at the edge of his vision, never fully forming, yet always present. He began to see patterns in the fog, shapes resembling those who had died, lingering in the places of their demise, frozen in perpetual liminality. By midnight, the temperature dropped sharply. Frost crept along the broken stone paths, mingling with dampness and the stagnant scent of decay. The lantern's flame shivered violently, casting fleeting, distorted shadows across the walls. Giovanni felt a subtle pull toward the cliff's edge, toward the northern point where the lagoon lapped against jagged rocks. He resisted, knowing instinctively that some areas were more dangerous, spiritually, than others. Yet curiosity, coupled with the necessity to document, drove him forward. At the northern cliffs he paused, staring into the black waters below. The surface was smooth, unnaturally still, reflecting the pale moonlight and misty clouds above. A faint ripple disturbed the reflection, though no wind stirred. Giovanni strained his eyes and then saw them. Figures moving beneath the water, pale and indistinct, yet undeniably human in form. He blinked, and they were gone, leaving only the gentle rocking of the lagoon against the rocks. Was it an illusion? The result of a mind pushed to the edge of exhaustion and fear, or something else entirely? As he turned back toward the island, the shadows seemed to close in, and the whispers grew louder, layered in overlapping cadence. Each echo carried fragments of warning: respect, fear, remembrance. Giovanni realized that he was not merely observing history, he was participating in it, becoming a part of the island's continuum of memory and suffering. The dead were not gone. They were interwoven with the landscape, bound to the soil, the stones, and the mist. Poveglia was alive in its horror, and he, like many before him, had become part of its story. By dawn, Giovanni returned to the central courtyard, exhausted yet compelled to record every observation. The island remained shrouded in fog, its presence both oppressive and awe-inspiring. Each sound, movement, and shadow became part of his narrative, a haunting testament to the resilience of memory and the persistent presence of death in a place where it had once been concentrated. Poveglia was no longer simply an island. It was a monument to mortality, a threshold where the living could glimpse the unseen, and where history's echoes demanded acknowledgement. The morning fog on Poveglia had deepened into a thick, ghostly veil, cloaking the ruins of the quarantine station in an eerie, almost otherworldly gray. Giovanni moved carefully through the remains of stone walls and collapsed buildings, his lantern flickering against the encroaching gloom. Even after weeks on the island, the sensation of being watched never waned. Every shadow, every subtle movement in the fog, carried the weight of centuries of suffering, and Giovanni could feel the cold fingers of unease brushing against the nape of his neck. He paused at the entrance to what had once been a small hospital wing, its roof long gone, leaving the interior exposed to wind and mist. The remnants of wooden tables and rusted medical instruments were scattered across the floor, and Giovanni could almost imagine the desperate hands of doctors and nurses working tirelessly in the face of death. Here, the island's history pressed in most heavily, and Giovanni felt the brush of unseen presence, as though the spirits of the long-dead patients lingered, replaying their final hours in loops of torment and confusion. A sudden chill swept through the room, carrying with it a whisper so faint it might have been his imagination. Yet the words seemed unmistakable. "Do not leave." Giovanni's heart quickened. He was accustomed to the fog, the wind, the sounds of the lagoon, but these whispers were deliberate, intentional, layered with a palpable urgency. He spun slowly, lantern raised, searching for the source. Shadows twisted across the walls, forming shapes both familiar and alien, fleeting faces of men, women, and children, whose eyes reflected anguish and despair. Giovanni pressed on, determined to document the phenomena. He moved toward the northern end of the wing, where the floor had partially collapsed into the earth beneath. A faint greenish light seemed to emanate from the fissure, pulsating like a slow heartbeat. Peering into the darkness, Giovanni caught glimpses of skeletal forms, some with remnants of tattered clothing, others completely bare bones, all arranged in positions that suggested both care and horror. The sight was a stark reminder that this island had served not just as a quarantine station, but as a graveyard, a repository of human suffering that had accumulated over decades. As he documented the scene, a sudden movement in the corner of his eye drew his attention. A figure emerged from the fog, draped in the remnants of a medical gown, its face pale and eyes hollow, yet focused directly on him. Giovanni froze. The figure moved slowly, its presence commanding the space, yet it made no sound. He realized instinctively that it was not alive in any conventional sense. This was a manifestation of the countless souls bound to the island, a residual energy of death itself. The figure extended a skeletal hand, pointing toward the stairwell that led to the upper floors of the ruined structure. Reluctantly, Giovanni ascended the stairs, each step groaning under his weight, echoing through the empty hallways. The upper floors were partially collapsed, yet the layout was discernible. Rooms once used for observation, isolation, and treatment now empty, except for debris and the lingering sense of presence. Shadows moved along the walls, forming vague silhouettes of patients, their postures bent and their movements repetitive, as if trapped in an eternal cycle of fear and pain. Whispers grew louder, overlapping in a dissonant chorus that seemed to convey warnings, lamentations, and memories all at once. At the end of the hallway, Giovanni entered a large room that had once served as a communal treatment area. Broken furniture littered the space, and the windows were shattered, allowing the fog to swirl freely within. On the floor, he noticed small piles of ashes and fragments of bone, carefully arranged as if in ritual. It was here, he realized, that the strongest presences lingered, drawn to the remnants of suffering, decay, and death concentrated over decades. A sudden gust extinguished his lantern, plunging him into near-total darkness. Giovanni's breath quickened, and he felt the weight of countless unseen eyes upon him, assessing, judging, acknowledging. From the corner of the room, a pale figure emerged, its features partially human, partially distorted. Its movements were fluid, unnatural, and it seemed to beckon him forward, not with malice, but with a strange insistence. Giovanni approached cautiously, documenting every detail in his mind. The figure paused, hovering above the remnants of a wooden table, and then vanished suddenly, leaving behind a faint residue of cold air and the unmistakable odor of decay. The effect was profound. It was as though the island itself had intentionally revealed a fragment of its history, allowing him a glimpse into the lingering spirits that refused to depart. As Giovanni descended the stairs, the fog outside thickened, almost as if the island was enclosing itself, keeping him within its boundaries. The whispers followed, indistinct yet persistent, forming a tapestry of sound that merged memory, warning, and lament. He understood that Poveglia was not merely haunted by individual spirits, but by the cumulative presence of countless lives lost in fear, isolation, and suffering. Every stone, every wall, every shadow carried memory, and the island was a living testament to mortality, grief, and the human desire to endure, even in the face of unimaginable horror. By the following morning, Giovanni had resolved to leave the upper floors and focus on the perimeter. As he walked toward the shore, he saw the mist shift, revealing vague shapes on the horizon. The lagoon was still, unnaturally calm, yet he could sense movement beneath the water, as if the souls of those consigned to the depths were watching. The island had not released him. It allowed him observation, but it demanded respect, caution, and acknowledgement. Every step toward the boat felt weighted, as though the history embedded in the soil was pressing against his legs, urging him to remember and to bear witness. Reaching the boat, Giovanni paused, looking back at Poveglia. The fog swirled around the ruins, the northern cliffs, and the skeletal remains of buildings, hiding and revealing different fragments of history with each movement of the mist. He knew he could never fully comprehend the horrors contained within the island, nor could anyone fully map the extent of its spectral inhabitants. Yet the experience had etched itself permanently in his memory. The whispers, the shadows, the greenish light, and the pale figures, all reminders that death leaves an enduring footprint and that some places, however small, carry the concentrated weight of centuries of human suffering. The island faded into the morning mist as the boat carried him across the lagoon, but Giovanni could not shake the certainty that Poveglia had observed him, catalogued him, and allowed him to leave only because it deemed him worthy, or perhaps merely curious. The whispers remained in his mind, faint echoes he would hear in the quiet moments of sleep, reminding him of the fragility of life, the permanence of memory, and the persistence of fear. Poveglia had become more than a quarantine station, more than a graveyard. It had become an eternal witness, and Giovanni, like many before him, had become part of its enduring narrative. The question lingered in his mind, unresolved and haunting. Would the island ever release those it claimed, or were all who stepped upon its soil forever bound to its shadows, wandering its ruins, whispering warnings to the living?